The most dangerous moment did not arrive when the Shah of Iran left the country. It arrived earlier, when authority felt so secure that it no longer experienced uncertainty as a signal. Revolutions are often imagined as sudden eruptions, crowds, slogans, collapse, but power rarely fails at the moment it is challenged. It fails earlier, when it becomes convinced that challenge has already been accounted for. In Iran, the coming rupture was not invisible. It was misread as background. For years, stability appeared not as an achievement, but as a condition. The monarchy presided over a state that looked organized, modern, and aligned. Oil revenues flowed with regularity. Infrastructure expanded. Military hardware arrived in quantity and sophistication. Diplomatic relationships were reinforced through ceremony and reassurance. The image projected outward and inward was one of managed continuity. Authority did not feel embattled. It felt established. This inquiry begins not with ideology or opposition, but with the environment of rule itself. Iran under the Shah was dense with institutions designed to govern information. Ministries produced data. Security services monitored dissent. Economic planners modeled growth. The state did not operate blindly. It saw extensively. What it saw, however, was filtered through a framework that assumed endurance. Observation did not lead to doubt. It led to confirmation. The Shah's power was personal, but it was not solitary. It rested on a web of loyalty, modernization policy, and external support. Legitimacy flowed from multiple sources at once: dynastic history, promises of national strength, and alignment with dominant global powers. This convergence reduced friction. Authority did not need to argue for itself constantly. It was already embedded in the structure of daily life. Over time, power learned to interpret calm as consent. Opposition existed, but it was fragmented and managed. Political parties were limited. Religious institutions were watched. Public protest was controlled through force when necessary and accommodation when useful. Each successful intervention reinforced the belief that unrest was episodic rather than cumulative. Power came to understand resistance as something that appeared, peaked, and dissolved. Listening persisted, but it changed shape. Reports moved upward, but their tone adapted. Information that fit within expectations circulated easily. Signals that implied deeper instability arrived, softened, contextualized, or delayed. This was not the result of a single directive. It was an emergent property of hierarchy. Survival within authority requires anticipation of what authority can absorb. As modernization accelerated, so did distance. Urban expansion, rising inequality, and cultural disruption altered social relationships faster than political structures adjusted. Traditional networks remained socially powerful, even as they were politically constrained. Mosques, clerical circles, and informal gatherings carried meaning that did not translate into official metrics. These spaces were not invisible to the state. They were simply not decisive, until they were. Oil wealth insulated authority from consequence. Economic inefficiency could be overridden by expenditure. Discontent could be managed through distribution or repression. The regime's capacity to absorb pressure became evidence of its permanence. Fragility did not announce itself through breakdown. It accumulated beneath abundance. External validation reinforced internal confidence. Western governments viewed Iran as a pillar of regional order. Military cooperation and diplomatic affirmation signaled that the monarchy was not merely stable, but necessary. This external coherence fed domestic authority. Power recognized itself through recognition. When allies expressed confidence, internal doubts lost urgency. The Shah's role increasingly concentrated symbolic and practical authority. Decision-making narrowed. Advisors remained present, but final judgment rested with a single figure tasked with holding incompatible forces together. This concentration was framed as responsibility, not dominance. Yet responsibility without contest becomes isolation. Over time, fewer alternatives survived the journey upward intact. Opposition, meanwhile, did not organize according to the regime's expectations. It did not produce a single leader or coherent platform. It emerged through sermons, strikes, mourning rituals, and dispersed protest. To a system trained to recognize threats through hierarchy, this diffusion appeared reassuring. Fragmentation was mistaken for weakness. The security apparatus, extensive and feared, played a paradoxical role. Its effectiveness at suppressing visible dissent reduced the regime's exposure to organic feedback. Fear limited public expression, but it did not eliminate conviction. It displaced it into spaces beyond surveillance's interpretive reach. What cannot be quantified rarely alters policy. As unrest increased in the late 1970s, the regime responded with familiar tools. Concessions were offered, cabinets reshuffled, repression intensified and receded. Each measure assumed that legitimacy remained intact, that authority could still recalibrate conditions. What had changed was not the availability of instruments, but their meaning. Actions once interpreted as adjustment were now read as hesitation. Power struggles to perceive thresholds. It experiences change as continuous until it becomes irreversible. By the time mass demonstrations filled the streets, the regime still interpreted events through categories designed for containment. It saw crowds, but not momentum. It heard demands, but not cohesion. Authority responded as if restoration were still possible. Listening at this stage became ritualized. Commissions were announced. Dialogues proposed. These gestures assumed that authority remained the mediator of conflict. They did not account for the possibility that authority itself had become the object of rejection. When power assumes it is the framework, it cannot easily accept becoming the question. The fracture did not arrive as sudden collapse. It appeared as hesitation. Orders were issued and reconsidered. Force was applied and withdrawn. Signals conflicted. This inconsistency revealed uncertainty that had long been concealed. Once revealed, belief shifted rapidly. Compliance recalibrated. Institutions continued to function, but interpretation slipped away. The Shah's illness intensified this erosion, not merely through incapacity, but through concealment. Uncertainty at the center was not openly acknowledged. The system continued to project certainty even as internal clarity diminished. Power maintained form after function had begun to fail. When the Shah departed, the rupture became visible. Yet by then, authority had already lost its capacity to define reality. It could command institutions, but it could not command meaning. Events no longer moved within its categories, they exceeded them. The uncomfortable question lingers beneath the collapse. At what point does authority become incapable of recognizing the conditions of its own survival? Not because information disappears, but because information no longer alters direction. When legitimacy depends on continuity, signals of discontinuity become intolerable. The Iranian Revolution did not emerge from invisibility. It accumulated within a structure that interpreted endurance as consent. Each successful suppression reinforced confidence. Each adaptation by dissent reinforced its resilience. Power mistook silence for absence and stability for alignment. The pattern extends beyond one monarchy or one moment. Authority that equates control with understanding will always struggle to perceive thresholds. It will listen selectively. It will measure narrowly. It will act within assumptions that cannot survive being challenged. In the final months, the regime still spoke the language of order. It issued statements, enacted reforms, and invoked continuity. Yet authority had already slipped from explanation. The future no longer awaited instruction. It moved independently. The revolution arrived not as surprise, but as recognition, sudden, collective, and irreversible. What failed was not intelligence or force alone, but the relationship between power and perception. When authority cannot revise its understanding of the world, it will eventually find itself ruling one that no longer recognizes it. The Shah did not fail to see the revolution because it was hidden. He failed to see it because, within the logic of his power, it could not yet exist. If you found meaning here, you're welcome to explore more on Timeless Questions, where we examine history not for answers, but for understanding.